So tonight we're going to talk about the age of accountability. The age of accountability. So what we're talking about when we use the phrase, the age of accountability, is the point in a young person's life when they first become accountable in the eyes of God. Right? They can be found guilty for their actions. But before that point, they were not able to be found guilty. They're not held accountable for their actions. So, is there such an age in the Bible? What does it mean to be held accountable for something or for your actions? Just playing piano back there. Just kidding. So to be held accountable, let me give you a scenario that could happen in everyday life. Let's say that a mother leaves a gun in her purse, leaves that purse laying around in the living room, and it just so happens that her 3-year-old son finds this gun in his mommy's purse, and she comes around the corner and he shoots his mom and kills her. Now that's something that could possibly happen. What's going to happen to that child for that action? Is he going to be sentenced to life in prison for taking the life of another human being? Is he going to be put on death row because he shot his mother? If that was an adult who shot somebody else and took their life, that's probably the punishment that they would receive. But are we going to give that same punishment to a little child? No. Right? Well, why not? Well, we'd all agree and we'd all say, well, because he didn't know any better. Right? He didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't capable of discerning and understanding rightly and correctly. He didn't know what was going on. And we might say he wasn't old enough to make the right decision. He didn't properly understand, hadn't matured yet. Right? Those are all answers we'd probably give. So this little child is not yet held accountable for his actions, meaning he's not punished. He's not found guilty for what he did because he hasn't reached an age of capable understanding yet. We get that. We get that in everyday life. So if you're held accountable for something, you are able to be found guilty for your actions. You're accountable because you knew better. Or you were capable of making the right decision, but you chose to do evil, and it's on you, so there's no excuse for you. What about a 9-year-old? Maybe a 7-year-old, somewhere in that age, a little bit smarter than a 3-year-old. Let's say a 9-year-old throws a rock off of a bridge and causes a death, a car accident of some kind of thing. Is a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old going to receive the same kind of a punishment? Are they going to be put on death row or something like that? Are they going to receive the same punishment as if somebody who was 25 or 35 did the same action? Right? And we know that wouldn't be the case. They would receive the same kind of punishment. That's actually the story that happened a little while ago in Michigan. I think it was around Clio area. Is those teenage boys who were 15 to 17. The question was, well, should they be tried as adults or should they be held accountable as adults or as children? If they actually, I believe, held them accountable as adults. And so because they believed that they had intentions, they knew what was happening and that they made that bad decision. So that was the predicament there. So, but the younger the person is, the easier it is to see that they're not held accountable to the same level as an adult. And here's another good question. What about a person who has something like Down syndrome or some mental disability, we could call it? All right, we don't administer the same type of punishment for a crime or some kind of action to someone like that because of their lack of mental capability, right? Their cognitive ability in their head. So, right, we're not going to throw a 3-year-old into prison for something, shooting his mom. We're not going to put a 10-year-old on death row or even a 13-year-old. Someone who has Down syndrome or a mental disability, we don't hold to the same standard of punishment as someone who can understand fully. We know they knew what they were doing. And so the spiritual application is, did you know that God takes this into account as well for human beings and our ages? Right? I believe everybody in here should be to the age of reason, that they're not a child anymore in their understanding. But God does take it into account for mankind. He uses the same kind of judgment when dealing with us. Who should be held accountable, who's not. The Bible tells us that God is fair. Right? God is a just God. Psalm chapter 97 verse 2 says, righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 4 says, for all his ways are justice, a God of truth and without injustice. Right? He's not unfair. God's going to do what's right. He's going to do what is just. So he's not going to throw somebody into hell who does not rightly deserve to be there, such as a little baby or a young child. And we've already established in our Calvinism lessons we've been talking about on Sunday that a newborn baby is not going to be punished in hell if it dies, right? A miscarriage or something. Well, why not? Well, we've already talked about that because a baby has not personally transgressed God's law. That's what sin is when you violate one of God's laws, you die. Or you're separated from God. So Ezekiel 18 verse 20 says, the soul who sins shall die. And we ask, what sin has a little baby who has entered into the world committed? And then that verse says, the son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. So we know that a baby first coming into the world is innocent, has a clean slate, hasn't yet separated himself or herself from God because there's been no transgression yet. But then the question comes along, well, what's the age? Well, let's talk about a toddler. A toddler has the ability to make choices. 2 years old, 3 years old. At what age are we actually able to sin against our God? Someone tried to use the argument against me when talking about original sin, trying to pin me in a corner. Well, how would you answer this? And they said to me, well, a 3-year-old can personally transgress God's law. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, a 3-year-old can lie. I was thinking, well, I guess that's true. Right? A toddler, did you do it? No, didn't do it. A toddler or a 3-year-old could disobey his parents. That's a transgression of the law. You're saying, right? That's written. Children, obey your parents. A 3-year-old could steal, take a piece of candy or something in a store. A 3-year-old could use a curse word. Let profane babblings come out of their mouth, things. So he used that argument against me, and I got to thinking, well, how do I answer that? Because it was a little bit hard to answer because it's true. A young child can tell a lie. Someone between 3 and 10, they can disobey their parents, which seems to go against God's law, right? And they could steal, they could use curse words, but this is where we have to understand the concept of justice with the age of accountability and how it works in our own system and how God would work as well. So just like the American justice system doesn't hold somebody accountable who doesn't have the mental capability yet, God's justice system takes that into account as well. Right? A person's mental status and their ability, their capabilities. And I think that's definitely true. The Bible talks about a point where children do not know the difference between good and evil, right? They cannot quite comprehend it fully yet. And I think that that point is quite significant in our discussion, that there is a point that the Bible talks about where the discernment isn't full yet. It isn't reached maturity yet. So because of this lack of capability by a young person, we can conclude that children are not yet held accountable in the same way a rational adult would be held accountable for actions. But that children, for a time period, are in a state of innocence in their actions until they come of age, right? Before they reach an age where they have reason. And so if you want a verse for this, Isaiah chapter 7 is one of them. Isaiah 7 verses 15 and 16. And we can read about this idea of such an age. So it says, curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by her kings. So without looking at any of the context there, because we don't have time, I'd like to simply point out that there is a point in a child's life, we see it there in Scripture, where they do not know. They do not have the knowledge to choose between good and evil. They cannot refuse the evil and choose the good. And we understand that with a child. And so they don't understand the distinction yet, because they're still learning. There's a learning curve, there's a learning process. So just like our illustration with a 3-year-old shooting his mama, young children are still learning right and wrong, and they're not yet capable of thinking entirely rationally. We have to understand that God will take this into account because He's just. And better yet, think about this: young children, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, maybe even 10 years old, getting up there. Many children cognitively are not capable of responding to the gospel invitation and fully making that commitment and understanding what they're doing, right? Because it requires conviction of what you've done. It hurts, what I've done against my God. And it requires us to know that I need to turn from this sin, I need to turn from that sin. Well, if you're not mentally capable of doing that, how could that young person be saved? So there's got to be some kind of a curve, and I believe it would have to be different with every person, right? It's hard to say, well, it's 12 years old. You know, and I really believe you get to a point, and I think we probably all experience it. You know, some of us are a little older than others to think back to that time period, but I remember a point where it was just like, I'm not a kid anymore. It's like you know what that this isn't right. What I've been doing isn't right, and finally it clicks. And I think God sees that. God knows that there's a point where you used to not be able to discern correctly between good and evil, and then you get to a point where you can, and it takes growth. And so there's a learning that goes on there. So, and here's another passage if you want to write this one down. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 39. This is when the 12 spies went into the land of Canaan, and all but 2 of the spies, right, Joshua and Caleb, came back with a bad report. And they were saying, we can't take the land. Right? There's giants in the land. We can't do it. And God wasn't very happy about that. And so God's judgment against the Israelites is that they shall not enter into the promised land. However, listen to the statement that He makes about their children. Okay, in Deuteronomy 1:39 it says, moreover, your little ones and your children, and listen to the phrase, who today have no knowledge of good and evil, they shall go in there. They're going to enter the land, and to them I will give it, and they shall possess it. So again, what do we read about children? Is that there is a point in a human's life where they have not yet come to a proper understanding of good and evil. Right? That verse says that your children today have no knowledge of between good and evil. So once they reach that age, then they're accountable, right? And so the conclusion that we can make on this subject is that children are not held accountable in their younger years. And at some point, it transfers over to you're not held accountable to God does hold you accountable. And I think with each individual person, they know. I think you know when you get to that point where I can understand now. And so that's why it's such the job of the parents while they're growing up to train up a child in the way he should go. And when he is old, he will not depart from it. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6. Proverbs 22 and verse 15 says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. Right? God knows there's foolishness there. That there's a lack of capability. There's foolishness. The rod of correction will drive it far from it. Right? So we teach the child, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. We could also mention Luke 18 and verse 16. But Jesus called them and said, but Jesus called them to him and said, let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Right? That's talking about toddlers. Of such is the kingdom of heaven. In 1 Corinthians 14 verse 20, Paul says, brethren, do not be children in your understanding, however, in malice, and that word means wickedness. In wickedness and evil, be babes. Right? Be a child in regards to evil. Don't be a child in your understanding, but in regards to evil. So there's plenty of proof that a child is not evil, is not held accountable, and there's definitely some good thoughts there that we can think about. So if anybody needs to make make the invitation call tonight. The water's ready. We can help you obey the gospel. And if anybody needs any prayers, please come right now while we stand and while we sing.